Thank you to the Commission, to my esteemed co-panelists. I am honored to be in conversation with you today. I want to begin by acknowledging the people forcibly kidnapped and sold from Africa who were enslaved on these lands. From this colony's founding in 1634 until 1864, when the state of Maryland abolished slavery, enslaved Africans were exploited and did work on this land, enabling us to live as we do today. I want to note that I am also an affiliate faculty member of the Gibson Banks Center for Race and the Law at the University of Maryland School of Law. I am an international scholar, and my areas of expertise include international human rights, public international law, racial justice, and transitional justice. And I want to begin actually by thinking about my own positionality as I come to this. White supremacists working with the American Colonization Society assisted formerly enslaved people to establish a colony called Liberia in West Africa. In March 1825 and 1829, Julia Ann Richardson and John T. Richardson, both aged 34, arrived in Monrovia, Liberia. Though the archives do not say the reason they departed the United States, this country's brutal racial violence and terror must have informed their decision to flee. My mother is their descendant, and I am my mother's daughter. I think that our conditioning is conditioned, and so for Black people to say things that aren't advancing Black people's liberation is not something that is new. That happened in the past, that happens today. And I think to invoke Toni Morrison, who has written about the master narrative and has helped us to think about how the ideological scripts by people in power function to limit our imagination. And what we can do in this place is to imagine, as our ancestors did, freedom as an actual place, right? So this is Ruth Wilson Gilmore thinking about freedom as a place. June Jordan, another one of our ancestors, wrote about how when our grandmothers were on their knees in the big house, they imagined a home full of family come to freedom, and that they did so, as Marcus was saying, that we could stand up, right? And so in this moment, it is on us to actually stand up to recognize that freedom is a place that is imagined, but is also one that is built and one that has to be demanded, and it is our job in the present to demand that.
And we can look to legal cynicism in terms of the double speak from the Biden administration and the Harris administration, the public admonitions to limit civilian casualties, at the same time continuing to fund and arm the slaughter in Palestine. And one of the things that I think is important to think of when we're considering this shrinking civilians concept is the way in which President Isaac Herzog of Israel has talked about, this is an entire nation that is responsible. It's not true, this rhetoric about civilians, not aware, not involved, is absolutely not true. And when the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, announced a complete siege of Gaza, he claimed that we really are fighting against human animals. And so there is some sense where civilians are not being recognized at all. And so IHL has a principle that says that the civilian population is to be spared, and that armed forces are supposed to distinguish between the civilian population and civilian objects, and military objectives on the other hand. And so that neither the civilian population as such, nor individual civilians or civilian objects should be the target of military attack sort of as such. So there's this principle of distinction between civilian objects, civilian populations, and military objectives and the like. And so when we look at the conflict that is taking place, we are to understand that every hospital and health facility that is targeted is purportedly a military objective. We are to understand that every school that has been destroyed is also ostensibly a military objective. Every industrial facility that's been decimated is also a military objective. Every religious institution that's been demolished is also a military objective. Every press office that's been bombed is apparently also a military objective, and every house and apartment that has been obliterated is seemingly also a military objective. And so it's as if the principles of distinction don't seem to apply. And so if we think about legal cynicism, that at its fullest, there really are no civilians and there really are no civilian objects. Every target of a strike is a dual purpose facility that has both military and civilian purposes commingled. And this dual use then has been stretched beyond credulity.
International law failed us spectacularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll take one example being that of access to vaccines. You had a proposal by India and South Africa to allow for greater access to things like testing, to vaccines, to treatment. And instead of responding in sort of a timely fashion and a substantive fashion to address that demand, international institutions instead stalled in terms of making a decision. And then when they finally made a decision, that decision was wholly inadequate in terms of responding to the need. Due to the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and colonialism, sizable communities of people of African descent were all across the world. Geopolitical hierarchies have meant that historically, Black people have not been easily able to translate their rights claims into positive law, either nationally, regionally, or internationally. Additionally, since human rights are often declared and claimed before being adopted into positive law, it is imperative to not simply prioritize positive law. By examining certain early rights claims asserted by Black people through ideas, discourses, social movements, as well as rebellions and uprisings, we can learn a lot about the meaning of human rights. Yet when one examines the human rights canon, conspicuously missing from the conventional accounts are the 1920 Declaration of the Rights of the Negro People of the World, put forward by the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the African National Congress's 1923 African Bill of Rights. This silencing and marginalization of rights claims articulated by Black people, even where the rights claims advanced are explicitly transnational and international in nature, furthers hierarchy and racial subordination in human rights. The inability to see Black people's early emancipatory struggles as foundational to human rights limits the vision of who the universal subject is or can be in human rights. And this has profound ramifications for the present day. Several commentators have researched Black internationalism and analyzed how connecting local struggles to broader international human rights advocacy was an important aspect of emancipatory efforts during the Civil Rights Movement, the decolonization movement, and the anti-apartheid movement, amongst others. However, what has not been adequately covered is how even before the development of a formal human rights regime beginning in the 1940s, Black people exercised agency, making and articulating rights claims. These histories, some captured in law, some not, are part of human rights genealogy and deserve to be recognized as such. Their continued marginalization in the human rights canon have real and deleterious effects. For one, it reinforces the idea of human rights as an exclusionary, othering concept, developed for the subjects of the South to become more like the North. Additionally, the relative erasure of Haiti and Liberia and other early rights claims asserted by Black people in human rights historiography undermines the political salience of human rights. Who was entitled to make a rights claim, to have those rights recognized, to vindicate their rights, to insist that those standards be realized, and to attempt to create a world which enables people to enjoy the object of those rights are imperatives to understand, not simply as a matter of theory, but crucially as a matter of praxis. Perhaps returning to the issue of who the universal subject is in human rights can help us to better understand the chants emanating from the streets around the world in 2020 that all lives cannot matter unless and until Black lives matter. I take seriously the words of Angela Davis that you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. I've tried to do that in my work. My work in the areas we've discussed today, international criminal law, transitional justice, global health, national security, racial justice, and human rights, is animated by making visible and troubling the hierarchy embedded and reflected in international law, and remedying the inequities reflected in it. We began this talk by talking about how instrumental international law was in dispossessing people across the globe. Given this history, can international law also be the vehicle that saves us from dispossession and the hierarchical nature of international law and the international order? It's an open question whether the project of international law can be redeemed from its foundational myths and histories. If there is any hope for redemption, the starting point must include centering excluded subjects, zones, and histories, of which there are many. By centering the marginalized and those whose rights have been systemically denied, by looking at the faces of the bottom of the well, as Derek Bell instructs, perhaps there is a way to tap into the transformative potential. As a child, I thought that international law and the international community would save us. Today, where I sit, looking at the world today, I realize that we are the ones that will save ourselves. It is clear that no one is coming to save us, but we can and we will save ourselves. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for the invitation to be able to reflect more on sort of the significance of the moment and, you know, the Constitution writing and drafting that they were doing. And they were doing so specifically for, you know, Black people, but not Black people sort of just located in Harlem or just located in the US. This was a sort of a Pan-Africanist vision or a diasporic vision or one that related to Black people all over the world. And so that is something that, you know, whether situated in the US or the Caribbean or across the African continent, that is something that I think is particularly important because that's certainly not universal, but it's more universal than some other projects, right? That we talk about as, you know, an important source of thinking about human rights. And so to the extent that this project, which is thinking about people across several continents and the rights of people across several continents, I mean, why do we not have further excavation of that just sort of as a standard, you know, as a standard thing for understanding the development of human rights and the role of human rights, you know?
The project of global public health could look like. We have an example from history of what the project of global public health has looked like, but what would it mean to actually dedicate space to thinking about radically imagining how we structure global public health and how we value or do not value local knowledge and how we value sort of biomedical interventions as sort of quick fix things. And one of the things that I think the call to decolonize is good for, amongst others, is that it forces us to think about structures and anything that focuses our attention on structures as opposed to sort of individual behaviors or individual interventions is something that is welcome, because anything that is hoping to sort of unpack the ways in which structures have reinforced, for example, subordination in history, is going to take a lot to undo and unpack. And so I think the task is not to reuse tools that have been problematic in the past, but is to use our and your imagination in school of thinking about, armed with the knowledge that you have, about how global public health has functioned in ways that are not necessarily emancipatory, to consider what an emancipatory global public health is. And if you don't have one, I think that also tells us something about the project of global public health as well. And so I think that there is something to be learned either way. And I think the future is bright for you and hopefully for us in this world, because you're sitting here thinking about ways in which we might imagine a more just world and then imagine a more equitable world in which maybe global public health doesn't look like what it looked like in the past, but maybe that's actually a good thing, right? Maybe we don't actually want it to be reminiscent of some of the legacies and histories that we've talked about today. So yeah, thank you for that.
Becca was just saying, it's hard to divorce international criminal law, period, from politics. And so international criminal law cannot exist in a vacuum. And so the ICC doesn't exist in a vacuum. So it makes sense that the International Relations Department is hosting this conference. And I think that the glass is half full, half empty, depending on which side of the divide you sit on in terms of assessing the ICC. I think 20 years on from the Rome Statute, 16 years in operation of the court, 1.5 billion spent, not that many either convicted or acquitted. I think the ICC has a lot to account for the work that it's been doing.